Life, like boxing, is a relentless sequence of blows, evasions, and brief moments to catch your breath. The city of Detroit, a place forged from industrial might and tempered by decay, was a living stage for this fight. Its air, thick with the metallic scent of exhaust fumes and the distant tang of the river, was a constant presence, a character as vital as the people who walked its scarred streets. The distant wail of a police siren, a sound that seemed to slice through the city's heavy calm, served as a grim punctuation mark to the quiet of the late afternoon. This urban landscape, with its brutalist architecture of abandoned buildings and the quiet, almost suffocating weight of history, was not merely a backdrop. It was a mirror reflecting a collective trauma, a place that, despite its scars, continued to fight, much like the young men who inhabited its concrete heart. In this world, the main antagonist was not a person, but a silent and ever-present force. It was a system that manifested itself in the subtle, suffocating indignities of daily life. For 17-year-old Elijah Turner, this system was an oppressive weight. His body was wiry, thin, yet held a nervous tension that made him seem bigger than he was, an animal constantly poised for flight or a confrontation that seemed inevitable. His eyes, meant to hold the curiosity of a teenager, were instead always vigilant, scanning his surroundings for any threat, a subconscious reaction to a world where violence and injustice could appear at any moment. He moved through the streets with a jerky, almost frantic energy, his worn-out sneakers slapping against the cracked pavement. His clothes, loose and faded, were a uniform of necessity, a sign of his place in a social labyrinth designed to keep young men like him trapped. The systemic pressure was a constant hum. It lived in the underfunded schools where classes felt more like a form of social control than a path to education. It whispered from the streets where loyalty was a currency you paid for safety. Elijah felt it in the way people looked at him, or more accurately looked through him, and in the constant gnawing awareness that he was perceived as less innocent than his white peers. His aggressive behavior was not a moral failing, but an armor, a manifestation of undiagnosed anxiety and depression born from daily exposure to trauma and violence. He was living the school-to-prison pipeline in real time, a path where Black students were disproportionately disciplined and funneled into the criminal justice system for typical adolescent behavior. The turning point began subtly. Elijah was on his way home when a police car, its siren silenced but its presence deafening, pulled up beside him. The sudden flash of blue and red lights against the grimy brick of a derelict building turned the world to an unnatural pulsing strobe. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the cold, hard gaze of two officers behind the car's tinted glass, a scrutiny he was accustomed to, but which never felt any less terrifying. The police, symbols of the system's power, had targeted him, not for a crime, but for his skin color, a daily reality for people of color in American cities. An officer's voice, amplified and detached through a loudspeaker, ordered him to stop and put his hands on the hood of the car. The words were a threat, a final confirmation of the trap he felt closing in on him. Elijah's mind raced, a blur of panicked thoughts. He thought of the constant advice from his elders: don't run, don't make any sudden moves, be polite. But a different, more primal instinct screamed at him. He felt the unfairness of it all, the cold injustice of a system that had already decided his fate, as if he were a character in a story someone else was writing. He had to run. He had to rewrite his own story. In a split second, he broke free, his thin legs a blur of motion. He sprinted down an alley, his lungs burning with each ragged breath. The oppressive silence of the alley was momentarily shattered by the sound of running footsteps and shouts, the cold, stale air pressing in on him. He could feel the panic rising, a choking feeling that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. He was not running from a person. He was running from the weight of a history he was born into, the expectation of failure. He took a blind turn, then another. The city's maze of brick and concrete became a blur. He just needed to disappear, to find a place where he could finally breathe. His desperate flight ended with a sudden, jarring stop, as he stumbled, colliding with an old door. The door gave way, and Elijah fell forward into a world of heat and sound. The air, which had been cold and suffocating on the street, was now thick and humid, heavy with the sharp metallic scent of sweat and the earthy aroma of old leather. The chaotic scream of the sirens outside faded, replaced by a rhythmic, hypnotic thwack, thwack, thwack of gloves on a heavy bag. He was in a boxing gym, a sanctuary of sweat and purpose. In this place, the fight was contained, predictable. In this place, the only opponent was the man in the mirror. The air on the street had been thin and cold, a bitter taste in Elijah's mouth. But inside, it was a living thing. It was hot, a humid thickness that wrapped around him and pulled the frantic energy from his sprinting body. It was a dense, heavy air, saturated with the sharp, metallic tang of sweat and the rich, dusty scent of old leather and canvas. He stood in the doorway, hunched over and gasping, the sounds of the city's labyrinth a fading memory. Here, in this new world, the sounds were different. They were a steady, rhythmic hum that was both foreign and strangely comforting. The chaotic wail of sirens was replaced by the hypnotic thwack, thwack, thwack of heavy bags being pummeled, a sound that echoed the very beat of a determined heart. The soft whipping whisper of a jump rope over a wooden floor offered a counter-rhythm, and a low, guttural grunt from a man sparring in a ring punctuated the air. This place, with its predictable, contained violence, was a direct and powerful antidote to the unpredictable, sprawling chaos he had just escaped. Elijah straightened up slowly, his body still tense, his hands balled into fists inside his worn hoodie. His eyes, accustomed to scanning for threats in the open, narrowed as he took in the space. Giant windows, grimy with years of dust, let in a sickly orange light from the setting sun, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. The room was a mess of organized purpose. Punching bags of all sizes hung from the ceiling, their leather exteriors scarred and worn. Old wooden benches were scattered haphazardly against the walls, and the large square boxing ring in the center of the room seemed to stand like an altar, a place of serious, almost sacred work. This was a sanctuary, a tabernacle for finding peace amidst the chaos of life. But Elijah's body and mind, still buzzing with the recent trauma, saw only another potential trap. He saw him then, a man standing in a quiet corner, taping the wrists of a young woman who looked no older than himself. This was Marcus Washington. His presence was not physically dominant in the way Elijah was used to from the street. There was no aggressive posturing, no confrontational bravado. Instead, it was an imposing stillness, a quiet power. His shoulders were wide, still holding the powerful form of a former fighter. The deep brown skin of his hands was a map of old calluses and widened knuckles, a testament to a life spent with gloves and leather. A faint, white scar curved just above his left eyebrow, a pale memory on a face that otherwise held no expression. He moved with a deliberate, smooth rhythm, his movements economical, a boxer's walk. Marcus's name, a common name for African-American men of his generation, hinted at a history and a quiet resilience. The young woman finished wrapping her hands and turned to hit a speed bag. Its leather drum, a quick, sharp snap, filled the air. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes meeting Elijah's from across the gym. There was no judgment in his gaze, no anger,
just a deep, unwavering observation that felt as though it could see every secret Elijah had ever held. He wasn't looking at a kid who had just run from the police. He was looking at the fear that had made him run. He saw the same nervous energy, the same fight-or-flight tension that he himself had once carried. Marcus knew what this place could offer, a chance to turn that destructive energy into something disciplined, something beautiful. He knew the gym was a place of second chances. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't gesture. The silent challenge was clear. He could either turn around and walk back into the night, or he could step into this space, a space of his own free will, and prove he was ready to change his narrative. Marcus understood that the real journey was not one of escape, but of confronting one's past with the only tools that mattered: discipline, respect, and hard work. Elijah, his heart still beating a frantic rhythm, felt the weight of the man's gaze. It was a weight that was not heavy, but inviting. The gym, which at first had seemed like just another building, now felt like a portal, a door to another life, a life where the rules were fair, where the fight was clean, and where a man could stand his ground without fear of being condemned for his existence. He took a hesitant step inside, the door swinging shut behind him. The faint, distant wail of a siren from the street was finally swallowed by the warm, constant breath of the gym.
The training began. It was not the spectacle Elijah had imagined from watching grainy videos on his phone. It was a brutal, focused ritual of repetition and muscle memory. Marcus started him with the basics, the alphabet of the ring. Footwork, a relentless, shuffling dance that seemed pointless at first, but was, as Marcus explained in his calm, gravelly voice, about learning to move with a purpose and to keep your balance in an unstable world. His legs burned, his lungs ached with each heaving breath, but Marcus simply stood, a silent, imposing figure, correcting his posture with a firm hand on his shoulder. Elijah learned to keep his hands up, a high guard that was not just for protecting his face from a punch, but for shielding himself from the constant, invisible threats that had defined his life on the street. The sensory details of the gym became his new language. The sting of sweat dripping into his eyes, the rough texture of the hand wraps against his skin, the sharp, percussive slap of his gloves hitting the worn leather of the heavy bag. Each thud was a sound of release, a way of channeling the coiled-up anger and anxiety that had been his constant companions. For Elijah, boxing was not just a sport. It was a form of meditation, a focused ritual that allowed him to transform his rage into something productive. Marcus, watching him with an old fighter's gaze, saw the unspent energy, the raw fear in the boy's eyes. He knew that the real work wasn't in building muscle, but in building the mind. As Elijah grew stronger, Marcus began to weave life lessons into the training. He would use anecdotes from his own life and from the lives of legendary black fighters, creating a tapestry of history that was as much a part of the training as the footwork. He spoke of Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, a man whose audacity had defied the social norms of his time. He told Elijah that Johnson's victory against the great white hope Jim Jeffries in 1910 had not been just a win, but a powerful act of defiance that had sparked racial violence across the country. He explained that Johnson's true fight was never just in the ring, it was against the global narrative of white supremacy that sought to keep him in his place. Marcus would often look at Elijah and say, in a voice that was both a reminder and a warning, that Elijah's own fight was not against a single opponent, but against the great white hope of his own reality, the systemic expectation that he would fail, be imprisoned, or fall back into the cycle that had ensnared so many others. He also spoke of Joe Louis, the brown bomber, a beloved figure who had transcended the color line but still faced a different kind of fight outside the ring. Marcus, in a quiet moment while Elijah caught his breath, recounted how Lewis, despite his immense success and a lifestyle of generosity, had been hounded by the IRS and struggled with financial and health issues. The story was a subtle way of telling Elijah that victory did not always bring peace, and that the fight against the system continued long after the final bell. A quiet reflection from Marcus would often punctuate the rigorous training sessions. He would sometimes look at his own calloused hands, remembering the ghosts of his past. The emotional scars, the self-imposed solitude were a part of his story, and a small, almost imperceptible flashback would show him in a moment of pain, alone with his thoughts in a dimly lit room, a manifestation of the trauma that many black men face but are often unwilling to address. He saw his own past reflected in Elijah's hesitant, wary movements. The young man's aggression was not what it seemed. It was a manifestation of the undiagnosed anxiety and fear he had internalized. For Marcus, the gym was not just a business. It was an extension of his soul, a place where he could guide a young person down a path he had narrowly avoided himself. Elijah began to understand. He was not just learning to throw a punch, he was learning to breathe when his body wanted to panic, to stand his ground when the world told him to run. The footwork drills taught him that every small step had a purpose, and the conditioning exercises taught him resilience. The stories of Jack Johnson and Joe Louis were more than tales of a bygone era. They were living examples of what a fighter truly was, a person who fought in and out of the ring, a person who understood that the hardest blows were not the ones that landed on the chin, but the ones dealt by a system that had always been against them. In the end, the gym was not a place of conflict, but of control. It was a place where Elijah could finally take control of his own narrative, where his identity would not be defined by the streets he ran from, but by the discipline he found within its walls.
The air felt different now, not just physically, but emotionally. Elijah walked the same streets he had once fled, but his body no longer held the same nervous, ready-to-bolt tension. The discipline of the gym had settled into his bones, a new kind of rhythm that felt more like a purpose than a defense mechanism. His steps were deliberate, his back straight, and his eyes, though still vigilant, now scanned his surroundings with the calm focus of a fighter. The world had not changed, but his relationship to it had. He carried a new kind of power now, not born of aggression, but of control. He felt the weight of the city, its decay and its unspoken histories, but for the first time he felt he was part of its resilience, not just a victim of its decline. He was no longer running from the labyrinth, he was learning how to navigate it. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sky a dull, flat gray that promised rain. Elijah was on his way to the gym, his mind already drifting to the rhythm of the heavy bag, when the world, as it often did, tried to pull him back. A police cruiser, parked nonchalantly at the corner, pulled away from the curb as he passed. The familiar, cold, mechanical hum of its engine was a sound that had always sent a jolt of panic through him. The car's windows were dark, reflecting his own image back at him. A young black man in a hoodie, a figure a system had already deemed suspicious. Racial profiling, a problem as old as the city itself, was a ghost that haunted him every day, and a reminder that for a young man like him, humiliating and often frightening detentions were a daily reality. He felt the familiar, sickening drop in his stomach. The instinct to sprint, to disappear into the blur of the back alley screamed at him, but Marcus's voice, calm and steady in his memory, urged him to breathe. Control yourself. Don't give them what they expect. The car pulled up and stopped, the two officers inside looking at him with a detached, clinical gaze. A voice, amplified and robotic, ordered him to stop. His hands, without him even thinking about it, went from his pockets to a raised guard position, a subconscious act of defense. The officers' bodies tensed. "What's that supposed to mean?" one of them asked, his voice low and sharp. The confrontation escalated not through action, but through perception. Elijah was not a person to them. He was a statistic, a potential problem waiting to happen. He was a symbol of the school-to-prison pipeline, a system where young men like him were funneled away from opportunity and into the justice system for offenses that would be ignored in their white peers. The weight of this systemic injustice was a physical force, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Then a new presence emerged. Marcus, having just stepped out for a moment to take a call, saw the scene unfolding and walked toward them. His pace was not a run, but a slow, deliberate approach, his very posture a statement of authority. He did not yell, he did not rush, he simply entered the space, his broad shoulders and calm demeanor a counterpoint to the tense, kinetic energy of the scene. The officers, used to dealing with young men who were either belligerent or terrified, seemed momentarily thrown by his presence. Marcus, his voice a low rumble, addressed them directly. "He's with me. Elijah's training at my gym." The officer, his face unreadable, replied that he was investigating a disturbance. He wasn't interested in the boy's story, only in the narrative the system had already written for him. The scene shifted to the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting area of a police station. This was the true ring, the place where the most important battles were fought. Marcus stood beside Elijah, a pillar of strength and a symbol of a different kind of authority. He wasn't just a coach now. He was a mentor, an advisor, a therapist, and the bad and good guy. He was fighting for Elijah outside the ring, using his reputation and a quiet, stubborn resolve to counter the police's narrative. He explained who Elijah was, what he was doing, and where he was going, as if his life, his history, was a fact to be argued and a truth to be defended. Elijah, meanwhile, had to fight his own internal battle. The fear and the rage, a familiar duo, pulsed through him. He felt the humiliation of being seen as a criminal, the injustice of a system that had already judged him. But he used the tools Marcus had given him. He felt the anger, but he did not let it consume him. He focused on his breath, the deep, slow intake and release he had practiced 1,000 times at the gym. This was a survival skill, the ability to stay calm and composed in the face of pressure. He stood his ground, maintaining his dignity even as his body trembled, a testament to the fact that the most important lessons of boxing had nothing to do with throwing a punch. The fight was verbal and legal. Marcus, his voice a steady drone, challenged the officer's assumptions and used the weight of his own respectable reputation in the community to get the story straight. The true victory wasn't a knockout. It was the slow, methodical process of chipping away at the narrative of a boy's criminality. In the end, the charges were dropped or significantly reduced. The details were less important than the outcome. Elijah was free to go. But the moment had left a scar, a palpable emotional weight that settled over him. The injustice, though it had not destroyed him, had left its mark. The victory was not one of triumph, but of survival. The hardest blows were not the ones that landed on the chin, but the ones dealt by a system that had always been against him.
The finality of the police station's heavy glass doors swinging shut behind them was not a moment of triumph, but of quiet, heavy relief. The air outside, a familiar mixture of diesel and damp concrete, felt different, less menacing. It was still the same air, but Elijah breathed it in as a free man, a small yet profound victory. The legal conflict had been resolved. The charges against him dropped or reduced to a minor infraction, a concession to the stubborn resolve of a man who had refused to let another young life be swallowed up by the system. Marcus, his face a mask of weary composure, walked beside him. There were no words of celebration. None were needed. The unspoken understanding between them, forged in the sterile confines of the station, was now as solid as the foundation of the gym itself. The walk back to the gym was a pilgrimage, It was a journey through the very landscape that had tried to define Elijah's fate. He saw the cracked pavement, the boarded-up windows, the distant, weary glow of streetlights struggling against the deepening dusk. But now, he saw them not as symbols of defeat, but as landmarks of a journey. He was no longer a boy running from his past. He was a young man walking into his future. His posture was different, his shoulders held with the quiet confidence of a fighter who had just survived a brutal round. His eyes, though still vigilant, were no longer wide with panic, but narrowed with a calm, purposeful focus. He was not just scanning for threats, he was observing the world with the clarity that comes from understanding its rules. The boxing lessons, Marcus had once said, were survival skills, and Elijah had just passed the ultimate test, using the discipline he learned in the ring to stay composed in the face of a true-life knockout. Back inside the sanctuary of the gym, the air was warm and humid, carrying the familiar smells of sweat and leather, the sounds of a life of purpose. This was a place where he wasn't a problem to be solved, but a person to be built. Marcus, who had always been a coach, had now fully embraced his role as a mentor, an advisor, a therapist, and the bad and good guy. His presence was a silent affirmation of Elijah's worth, a foundation of trust that had been built on countless hours of shared struggle. The true victory wasn't a shiny trophy, or even the dismissal of a charge. The real win was the fundamental change in Elijah's narrative identity. He was no longer the street kid that the system had tried to brand him as. He was the fighter, the survivor, the one who had learned to stand his ground not with aggression, but with poise and discipline. The final scene unfolded with a sense of quiet destiny. A young boy, no older than 10, with a timid and wary look in his eyes, stood in the corner of the gym clutching a worn gym bag. He was the spitting image of Elijah on his first day, small, wiry, and on the verge of making a terrible decision. Elijah, catching a glimpse of the boy's fearful expression, felt a shift inside him. The raw, desperate energy of the street that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a deep well of empathy. He walked over to the boy, his own calloused knuckles a testament to his journey. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside him, a reassuring presence. He picked up a pair of hand wraps and began to unroll them, the soft rustle of the fabric a quiet invitation. The boy, his eyes wide, watched him with a mix of curiosity and fear. Elijah, without looking at him, began to wrap his own hands. The act was a silent message, a way of communicating a world of lessons without a single word. He was not just a boxer now. He was a bridge, a living example of how the sport was not about winning a title, but about giving a young person a fighting chance at a life that a cruel system had tried to take from them. The narrative ends not with a grand finale, but with a beginning. It is a beginning that acknowledges the persistent, ongoing nature of the fight. The systemic inequalities and the silent antagonist of racism do not disappear overnight. But the story's true resolution is in the continuity of the legacy. The image of Elijah helping the next generation, passing on the lessons of endurance and resilience he had learned from Marcus, is a powerful statement. It shows that the true victory is found not in eliminating the enemy, but in giving the next fighter the tools to confront them. The cycle of hope, mentorship, and survival continues, a quiet and profound defiance in the face of a world that keeps punching.